Load shedding.
Load shedding.
Load shedding and
Load shedding.
Load shedding.
Why is Eskom failing to keep the lights on? Now, the conventional answers point towards corruption, brazen criminality, and the government's incompetence as the fundamental roots of the crisis at Eskom. We're constantly told that the dysfunction we see at Eskom is inherent to state-owned utilities, and that the only solution to load shedding is the unbundling of Eskom and the creation of a free and competitive energy market. Now, here's why some of that isn't true. No one can deny the corrosive and destructive effect corruption has at a utility such as Eskom. You combine years of corruption with brazen criminality, and what you get is an ailing utility that doesn't have the capacity to sustainably generate, transmute, and distribute power to South Africans. However, Eskom's profound problems do go beyond mere pervasive corruption. The crisis of load shedding has been sustained by the South African government's attempt to restructure the energy sector on a for-profit basis. That may sound like a contradiction. How can a state-owned utility that is meant to deliver a vital public good be run on the basis of what is profitable? But this is precisely the contradiction at the heart of Eskom's multiple issues. Although Eskom is a state-owned utility, ideally meant to serve the public good, for all intents and purposes in regards to its financing, the management of its daily operations, and the culture which governs the utility, Eskom is run like a private company. And it's this contradiction between Eskom's public ownership and its corporate mandates which has produced and sustained load shedding, deepened energy poverty for millions, and burdened the utility with mountains of unsustainable debt. For nearly 16 years, South Africans have had to endure varying levels of national rolling blackouts, commonly known as load shedding. Simply put, load shedding is an engineered power shutdown that occurs when South Africans use more electricity than Eskom has in its available supply. So in order to meet the demand without overburdening Eskom's capacity, load shedding is the rotation of the available supply of electricity amongst consumers, otherwise known as customers, according to Eskom. Unsurprisingly, load shedding has evolved to become a national crisis. The constant interruptions in energy supply mean that economic growth is restrained, small businesses are suffocating under the pressure, and the likelihood of us being able to deal with unemployment significantly decreases as well. Leaders in the agricultural sector have warned that the continued interruptions to electricity supply may lead to national food shortages, which is a terrifying thing to consider in a country where millions of people already experience extreme food insecurity. And in a country where an estimated 18 million people live on less than $2 a day, interruption to the supply of electricity degrades the provision of public health care and education, while deepening poverty and worsening inequality overall. The unfolding energy crisis has become a vivid representation of the multiple catastrophes which now define the ANC's governance. Amidst all the chaos and confusion, we keep having to ask ourselves, how did we get into this mess in the first place? It's important that we ask ourselves these questions to remind each other that the crisis we find ourselves in is not insurmountable. A series of political choices and policy decisions have created the mess at Eskom. If we want to confront and solve the energy crisis, it's important that we are armed with a firm understanding of what is killing Eskom and why. Ultimately, Eskom's decay is the outcome of the ANC's commitments to neoliberal policy. So if we want to understand the mess at Eskom, we have to ask ourselves, what is neoliberalism and what does it have to do with load shedding? You may be familiar with neoliberalism as a set of economic practices and policies which purport to create wealth and prosperity by enforcing austerity, deregulation, the privatization of public services, and the enforcement of labor market flexibility. What neoliberalism has looked like in terms of people's lived experiences since the 1980s is stagnant wages, high levels of inequality and unemployment, the slow disappearance of public goods, debilitating outcomes in terms of mental health and education. These are the destructive fruits of neoliberalism on a global level. It's important to remember that legislation and policy are not inherently neutral instruments used for fair and efficient governance. They reflect political interests, sometimes dominating, at other times competing, and often they are a reflection of negotiation, compromise, and deliberation. And this is why we need to realize that neoliberalism isn't just bad economic policy made by short-sighted economists. It's important to ask ourselves, what political interests are reflected in the governance and the macroeconomic policies of the ANC since 1994? To begin answering this question, we can then turn to author David Harvey. David Harvey describes neoliberalism as a political project, specifically aimed at re-establishing the conditions for capital accumulation and restoring the class power of economic elites. So what does Harvey mean by class power? He's referring to the power of those who, through their private ownership of economic production, have the ability to decide what is produced, where it is produced, how it is distributed, and how much people get paid to produce products and goods and services in the first place. In other words, he's referring to the power of CEOs, the presidents of investment firms, the shareholders at multi-billion-dollar companies. Basically, neoliberalism steers all of society towards endless profit-making. So how does Eskom fit into all of this? By the early 1980s, Eskom was facing a series of new challenges. The 1973 oil crisis and years of international sanctions combined to add pressure to Eskom's costs, resulting in higher tariffs and widespread frustration for those who did have access to electricity. In 1984, the apartheid government launched the De Villiers Commission, aiming to review Eskom's operational and planning processes. Now, the recommendations of this commission were brought to life in two pieces of legislation, the Eskom Act of 1987 and the Electricity Amendment Act of 1985. It was these two pieces of legislation which signaled Eskom was becoming a commercial entity. So Eskom would change its name, now being spelled with a K instead of a C, and it would no longer operate as a non-profit entity, but rather begin to function on a commercial basis, meaning it would have to raise capital through sales and through loans on the market. It would be governed by an electricity council, and for the first time in the utilities history, this council would include private capital being involved in the executive decision-making of the utility. Rather than prioritizing the provision of an affordable public good, citizens were turned into consumers, and the importance of Eskom's profitability was elevated to new heights. The change in Eskom's governance and financing needs to be considered in the context of global neoliberal economics transforming the nature of public utilities. Eskom's gradual transformation from the 1980s onwards into our new democracy signifies a fundamental change within the South African economy at large. According to Gentile, it was a change from a Keynesian racial capitalism in which the state secured the conditions necessary for accumulation for the capitalist class as a whole, based on cheap black labor power, cheap energy, and regulated capitals, to a neoliberal state attempting to open up new arenas for commodification. By the time of Nelson Mandela's release in 1990, neoliberalism had grown to become a global ideology, embraced by institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and also glorified by powerful nations such as the United States of America. The hegemony of neoliberalism, enhanced by the collapse of the Soviet Union, narrowed the possibility of developing countries pursuing economic policies which were not just the implementation of austerity, privatization, and tax cuts for the rich. Soon, moderates within the apartheid government realized that their economic interests could be protected without enforcing racist political oppression. And importantly for capitalists, South Africa's economy, one based on cheap labor and cheap energy, had to remain intact. But capitalism would have to evolve in order to unveil new arenas of commodification and capital accumulation. For South Africa's ruling classes, reforming the economy presented an opportunity to protect their profit-making ability into the new South Africa. Fearing economic isolation in an age of global neoliberal dominance, Nelson Mandela's ANC was unfortunately forced to make a series of compromises and concessions in regards to the makeup of the post-apartheid economy. From 1996, the ANC's macroeconomic policy, to varying but significant degrees, would reflect the fundamental practices of neoliberalism. In the words of Ronnie Castrol's, optimism overlooked the tenacity of the international capitalist system. From 1991 to 1996, the battle for the ANC's soul got underway and was eventually lost to corporate power. We were entrapped by the neoliberal economy, or, as some today cry out, we sold our people down the river. What I call our Faustian moment came when we took an IMF loan on the eve of our first democratic election. That loan, with strings attached that precluded radical economic agendas, was considered a necessary evil, as were concessions to keep negotiations on track and take delivery of the promised land for our people. Doubt had come to reign supreme. We believed, wrongly, that there was no other option, that we had to be cautious, since by 1991, our once powerful ally, the Soviet Union, bankrupted by the arms race, had collapsed. Inexcusably, we had lost faith in the ability of our own revolutionary forces to overcome all obstacles. If neoliberalism is a set of economic practices, then we need to ask ourselves, what is the role of the state within a neoliberal economy? Now, according to David Harvey, the function of a state is to create the legislative and the political framework appropriate to neoliberal practices such as privatization or austerity. The neoliberal reforming of the state can be clearly seen through Eskom's gradual corporatization beginning in the 1990s and continuing into the early 2000s. With the arrival of democracy, Eskom pursued a massive electrification program between 1994 and 1999. At the end of 1993, only an estimated 36% of South Africans had connectivity to the grid. However, by the end of 1999, Eskom, in cooperation with local authorities, had managed to increase overall electrification to 66%. And most of those connections were for South Africans who couldn't afford to buy electricity through market prices. And we should begin to question if the private sector has the capacity, the coordination, or even the interest in achieving such levels of mass electrification. By the late 1990s, it was becoming increasingly clear that Eskom would have to sustain building new generative capacity in order to meet a growing demand within the population and in the economy. But such a big project led by a state entity and financed through public investment was not in line with the neoliberal outlook of the Growth, Employment and Redistribution Plan adopted by the ANC in 1996. A 1998 white paper on energy placed a moratorium on Eskom building any new generative capacity. The government did not see a need to invest in Eskom's generative capacity, instead hoping to open the sector to private players and private sector investment. What this tells us is that as early as the 1990s, the government had been laying the groundwork to create an energy market, with the 1998 white paper on Eskom envisioning 30% of energy being produced by the private sector within several years. So when Eskom requested government's approval to initiate a new build program, it was denied. And for the first time in 2007, load shedding struck South Africa. In a public apology after the announcement of load shedding, former President Thabo Mbeki apologized to the South African public and admitted government's error. When Eskom said to the government, "We think we must invest more in terms of electricity generation," we said no. Mbeki admitted in late 2007. We said not now, later, we were wrong, Eskom was right, and we were wrong. The private sector did not have an interest in building new power stations, not because they're incapable, but because companies are driven by the profit incentive. In other words, the cost of investing in new generative capacity without substantial subsidies from the state would not have yielded profit. And it is this profit incentive which determines the direction in which businesses choose to invest. In the meantime, Eskom's corporatization continued. The 1998 Eskom Amendment Act saw the utility become a limited liability company. Its tax-exempt status was removed and the government became its sole shareholder. Essentially, a public good became heavily commodified and citizens became consumers. By 2001, Eskom was fully corporatized, a public entity acting on the basis of a private company. This manifests most clearly with the full cost recovery model, which simply means Eskom must raise profits through the sale of electricity to end users, being people such as you and myself, Through the profits and revenues that Eskom is able to generate the sale of electricity, it must then use those funds to maintain its operations, to do maintenance on its infrastructure, and invest in building new generative capacity, or in other words, in building new power stations. The full cost recovery model has burdened Eskom with a severe problem. In a country where over 18 million people live in extreme poverty and millions are unemployed, it is quite difficult to demand that people pay for electricity and expect one's utility to remain profitable. As the economic situation in the country has deteriorated, by this I mean more people falling into unemployment and poverty, the available pools of revenue for Eskom have significantly shrunk. In order to respond to this crisis, Eskom either raises tariffs or takes out more loans. Simply put, consumers don't have enough money to bankroll Eskom. This financing model and the neoliberal outlook which govern Eskom's operations have deprived millions of a reliable, affordable, and safe access to electricity. A feature of Eskom's financing model that you may find surprising is its ineffective and inequitable tariff structure. For example, the 8 corporations which make up the energy-intensive users group consume about 40% of Eskom's energy, and yet they contribute less than 40% to Eskom's revenue. And the same applies to the mining and manufacturing sector, which consume about 60% of Eskom's energy. This disproportionate contribution in terms of revenue is another instance in which economic policy is crafted towards the interests of economic elites, such as those who have corporate power, even if it is unsustainable and even if it comes at the expense of most ordinary South Africans. Like Eskom, South Africa's municipalities are expected to recover the costs of providing services through revenue generated from citizens paying for waste collection, electricity, water provision, and so on. This cost recovery model, combined with a pervasive culture of corruption, has ruined the free basic electricity program. Of the estimated 11 million households identified and funded through the national budget for an assortment of basic services, only 25% of that number actually receive these services. There is a big gap between houses funded for basic services, such as free electricity, and what municipalities actually end up providing for. Making this misgovernance worse is municipalities devouring funds meant to provide for free basic electricity. According to the Public Affairs Research Institute, in the 2019-2020 financial year, 9 billion was budgeted and dispersed by the Treasury to local governments for the provision of electricity and was subsequently misappropriated for unauthorized purposes. From 2015 to 2020, an estimated 38.3 billion rands failed to reach indigent households. It was instead appropriated by municipalities for unsanctioned ends. A 2013 study by the Socio-Economic Rights Institute of South Africa discovered that the bureaucratic and administrative hurdles made it difficult for poor citizens to get free basic electricity even when they were registered. This research offered by the Socio-Economic Rights Institute suggests that municipalities are restricting rather than expanding access to free basic electricity. This is seen in how municipalities struggling to provide basic services then sell electricity at a higher price than Eskom, of course to the detriment of poor and working class people. By not thoroughly informing and registering citizens for the free basic electricity program and marking up the price of Eskom's electricity, municipalities are attempting to recover the cost of provision. And this task is made increasingly difficult as more and more citizens fall into poverty and unemployment, unable to pay for basic services. We should question this deep commodification of public goods and services and whether it is in fact sustainable. By the end of December 2022, municipalities around South Africa owed Eskom more than 56.3 billion rand, up from 44.8 billion rand in March of 2022. Electricity has become a basic need for all South Africans, required not only for survival, but in order for people to pursue development. We should question why a public good has become so thoroughly commodified, and why a public entity is being run on the basis of a private company. Why is Eskom so heavily indebted? And why has the utility struggled to pay off its massive debt? In order to answer this question, we need to go back to 2008. The government had realized it had severely fumbled, and so it was time for Eskom to boost its generative capacity. With license from the government, the utility pursued a new 5-year build program. Rather than amassing the funds through public investment, however, the government turned towards the World Bank. In 2010, a $3.75 billion loan from the World Bank was approved towards Eskom's construction of the Medupi coal-fired power plant. This loan was granted on the assurance that firstly, it would boost Eskom's generative capacity, but also that this power station would stand in the world as a signal of South Africa's efforts to transition to renewable energy and a decarbonized economy. What seemed like a victory for Eskom would soon reveal itself to be a long-term disaster. Investigations soon revealed that the 2010 World Bank loan to Eskom was mired in deep levels of corruption. Chancellor House Holdings, the investment arm of the ANC, owned 25% of Hitachi Power Africa, the company which had been contracted to build boilers at Medupi Power Station. As expected, the ANC was greatly enriched by up to 1 billion rand, earning a 5,000% return on their investment with Hitachi Power Africa. The initial cost of Medupi Power Station was estimated to be at about 69 billion rand. And yet in 2019, it was revealed that the construction of this power station has now cost Eskom 234 billion rand 10 years later. Further complicating the project were constant design issues and construction delays. Although corruption has certainly put Eskom in a terrible financial position, it doesn't solely emanate from the public sector or the government. David Malpass, the current president of the World Bank, back in 2017, accused the bank of habitual corruption in its relationships with developing countries, and South Africa was explicitly mentioned. In order to cover the costs of electrification and servicing its massive debt, Eskom has tried to boost its streams of revenue by always raising tariffs. In other words, South Africans are now paying the price for governments compelling Eskom to outsource its financing. In just the past decade, tariffs have increased by a bewildering 400%. Clearly, this World Bank loan has contributed significantly to the mountain of debt that Eskom has now accrued. It was not given in the best interest of the South African people or the government. The World Bank was aware of the culture of corruption that had taken place at Eskom. And most importantly, this loan results from the ANC's attempt to compel Eskom, due to its neoliberal commitments, to seek private or external financing. Compounding Eskom's costs in terms of servicing its debt and doing effective maintenance has been the introduction of independent power producers into South Africa's energy system. The utility claims that its requests for tariff increases are in part due to the costly power acquired from independent power producers, who account for more than a third of Eskom's total energy costs, even though these IPPs themselves produce well below a third of total energy output. Secondly, there is the dramatic rise in the price of coal over the past 15 years, primarily due to growing demand for cheap coal, but also due to lucrative black economic empowerment contracts within South Africa's fossil fuel industry. Finally, there is the failure of government in not allowing Eskom the license to directly procure diesel from wholesalers, which would save the utility up to 1.2 billion rand a year alone. Now that we understand Eskom's corporatization, alongside understanding where a huge chunk of its debt comes from, we can begin approaching the issue of the death spiral. Simply put, this occurs because Eskom has been saddled with the full cost recovery model. In other words, government expects Eskom to raise revenue and profits through the sale of electricity to end users, being you and I as South Africans. The problem, however, is the majority of South Africans are poor, unemployed, financially precarious, having to suffer through significant rises in the cost of food and fuel, alongside steepening interest rates and increasing amounts of household debt. Simply put, South Africans can't afford the electricity that Eskom sells. And so, Eskom is then compelled to seek financial support from international financiers through loans, or by borrowing domestically from government institutions such as the government's employee pension fund. As Eskom struggles to service its debt and also has to endure narrowing streams of revenue, the utility constantly raises the price of electricity, leading to non-payment and more people simply hopping off the grid and finding alternative ways of accessing energy. Of course, in the meantime, as Eskom is caught in this cycle of raising tariffs, increasing its debt, relying on private finance, critical maintenance is not done, and the building of critical infrastructure to generate power is also severely neglected, therefore sustaining load shedding. It is clear that neoliberal governance has created an increasingly inhospitable world, and South Africa's energy crisis stands as testimony to this depressing reality. The slow decay of Eskom and the destruction unleashed by load shedding has compelled many South Africans to think privatization is the solution. There are those of us who believe that we must go full throttle with the neoliberal measures introduced in the early 1990s. However, this is a mistake. Amplifying the contradictions at the heart of Eskom's crises is not likely to solve any of our problems. So it's clear that the crisis at Eskom doesn't begin with load shedding, but rather begins with the pursuit of a neoliberal fantasy, a fantasy that the provision of public goods could be an arena for profit-making. And now, as South Africa stands on the edge of economic collapse and real political implosion, we should all begin questioning whether this neoliberal fantasy is something we think is still worth pursuing.